Honestly, look at her. Probably some lonely tourist who thinks a sailor is going to sweep her off her feet. Ma'am, this is a real bar. We drink whiskey here, not tap water. The small group of uniformed police officers around Sergeant Miller chuckled, their laughter a brittle, sycophantic sound in the low-ceilinged clamor of the anchor line. The bar was a local institution, a place carved from old ship timber and smelling perpetually of salt, stale beer, and fried fish. It was a liminal space where the city's authority, its police force, met the nation's power, the sailors from the massive naval base that dominated the town's economy and its psyche. Tonight, the air was thick with the usual Friday night tension, a low hum of testosterone and civic pride. The woman, the target of Miller's derision, did not react. She sat alone in a dark corner booth, a place that offered a clear view of the entire room, including both the entrance and the back exit. She had been there for over an hour, a solitary figure of stillness in the swirling eddy of noise and movement. She looked to be in her mid-50s, her hair a practical mix of steel gray and brown, pulled back into a simple, severe bun that exposed a faint, silvery scar just above her right temple. She wore no makeup, no jewelry save for a plain, functional watch on her wrist. Her clothes were a uniform of anonymity, a dark gray wool sweater, well-worn blue jeans, and sensible flat shoes. In a room full of crisp uniforms and youthful bravado, she was utterly, deliberately unremarkable. But when the senior-most naval officer in the room, a grizzled chief petty officer with 3 decades of sea time etched into the lines of his face, saw her posture, he subtly shifted in his seat and lowered his voice. He saw not a lost tourist, but a sentinel's stillness. He saw a back that was perfectly straight, never once touching the booth behind her. He saw eyes that, while seemingly fixed on the condensation of her water glass, scanned the room in a slow, methodical pattern, a human radar sweep that cataloged every face, every gesture, every shifting alliance of bodies. He saw a quiet that wasn't passive, but predatory. If you believe that true strength doesn't need to be announced, type silence below. The woman, Admiral Evelyn Hayes, commander of United States Fleet Forces Command, took a slow, deliberate sip of her water. Sergeant Frank Miller, on the other hand, was a man who believed strength was a performance. He was a big man, made bigger by his uniform and the gear on his belt. He had a booming voice that he used to hold court, a casual arrogance born from being a local football hero, then a cop in the same town his entire life. He saw the world in simple terms: insiders and outsiders, predators and prey, cops and everyone else. To him, this woman was an outsider, a piece of civilian flotsam washed up in his world. Her silence was not strength. It was a vacuum, an invitation for him to fill it with his own noise. He continued, his voice louder now, playing to his audience of younger, impressionable officers. Seriously, I don't get it. You come into a place like this, a place with history, a place for people who serve, and you just sit there, like a ghost. It's disrespectful. He was projecting, painting her with a brush of his own insecurities. Her quiet competence was an affront to his loud, performative version of it. The chief petty officer across the room caught the eye of his 2 junior sailors and gave a nearly imperceptible shake of his head. The message was clear: stay out of it, don't engage. He had seen men like Miller before, men who mistook a quiet harbor for shallow water, never suspecting the crushing depths that lay beneath. He had also seen a handful of people like the woman in the corner. He didn't know who she was, but he recognized the species. It was the same calm he'd seen in a bomb disposal technician approaching a live device, the same stillness in a SEAL team leader just before a breach. It was the absolute absence of wasted energy, a conservation of force for a moment that might never come, but for which one must always be prepared. Admiral Hayes finished her water. She didn't look at Miller. She didn't acknowledge the laughter. Her focus remained internal, a fortress of discipline built over 35 years of service in a world that had constantly tested her. She remembered being the only woman in her class at the Naval Academy, the sneers and doubts that followed her from the classroom to the bridge of her first destroyer. She remembered the dismissive looks from foreign dignitaries who assumed her male aide was the one in charge. She had learned early that arguing was a waste of breath. Proving was everything. Her entire career had been a silent refutation of the world's loud assumptions. This loud, preening police sergeant was just another Tuesday. He was background noise, a minor atmospheric disturbance in a life spent navigating hurricanes. She considered leaving, but a deeper instinct, a commander's instinct, told her to stay. Something in the bar's chemistry was off. It wasn't just Miller's blustering. It was a nervous energy radiating from a table near the door. A man who had been drinking too fast, his eyes darting around with a paranoid intensity. Her internal threat assessment matrix was quietly running, tagging him as a variable to watch. Miller, emboldened by her continued silence, took a step closer to her booth. "Hey, I'm talking to you. You deaf? Or just rude?" His voice cut through the bar's din, and now more people were watching. The sailors were tense. The young cops looked uncomfortable. The bartender paused, polishing a glass, his eyes wary. The chief petty officer slowly placed his hands flat on his table, ready to stand. This was the point of escalation, the moment where a foolish man pushes one step too far. Admiral Hayes finally moved. She turned her head, slowly, with the deliberate motion of a gun turret acquiring a target. She didn't lift her chin in defiance or lower it in submission. Her gaze was level, her eyes a flat, neutral gray. For the first time, she looked directly at Sergeant Miller. She didn't speak. She just looked. And in that look, there was a profound and terrifying emptiness. It was the look of someone who had stared into the abyss and seen it blink first. It was a gaze that had assessed strategic threats, signed deployment orders that sent thousands into harm's way, and looked at satellite images of devastation without flinching. For a split second, Miller felt a cold spike of uncertainty. He saw something ancient and powerful in those eyes, a glimpse of a world he couldn't possibly comprehend. The feeling was so alien, so jarring, that he immediately dismissed it, covering his momentary lapse with more bluster. He scoffed, turning back to his men. "Whatever. Forget her. Some people are just lost causes." He walked back to his table, the laughter from his men a little more forced this time. The tension in the bar receded, but it didn't disappear. It coiled, waiting. The chief petty officer relaxed his hands, but he didn't take his eyes off the woman in the corner. He had seen that look before. It was the look of command. The shift happened in a heartbeat. The front door of the anchor line crashed open, slamming against the wall with a sound like a gunshot. The paranoid man from the corner table, the variable Hayes had been tracking, was suddenly on his feet, but he was too slow. Two figures, clad in black hoodies and ski masks, burst in. One was large and carried a sawed-off shotgun, its menacing black eye sweeping the room. The other was wiry, brandishing a long, wicked-looking knife, his movements jerky and unpredictable. Nobody move. Wallets and phones on the table. Now, the man with the shotgun roared, his voice raw with adrenaline and rage. Panic, a wild and contagious animal, was unleashed into the room. A server screamed and dropped a tray of glasses, the sound of shattering glass adding to the chaos. Patrons dove under tables or scrambled for the back exit, which the knife-wielding man quickly blocked. The young cops with Sergeant Miller fumbled for their sidearms, their training suddenly a distant memory in the face of a real, immediate threat. Their movements were clumsy, jerky, broadcasted. Miller, to his credit, reacted faster. He drew his weapon, his voice a bellow of authority. "Police, drop your weapons. Now." But his voice, which had dominated the room moments before, was now just more noise in the cacophony of fear. The shotgun-wielding robber laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "A hero. I got something for heroes." He swung the shotgun toward Miller, the gesture sloppy but deadly. The situation was deteriorating with terrifying speed. It was a classic flashpoint, a chaotic event where training either took over or evaporated completely. For Miller and his men, it was evaporating. And in that maelstrom of screaming, shouting, and fear, Admiral Evelyn Hayes moved. While every other person was reacting to the noise, she was reacting to the silence between the heartbeats. She didn't stand up. She flowed. In one smooth, continuous motion, she slid from the booth, keeping her profile low, using the panicked crowd as a moving shield. Her mind was not a place of fear, but a cold, clear chamber of tactical analysis. She saw the geometry of the room, The angles of fire, the positions of the assailants, the locations of the civilians, and the flawed reactions of the police. Miller was creating a standoff, a fatal funnel near the front door. He was escalating, not containing. He was making himself a target and endangering everyone behind him. The man with the knife was the immediate problem. He was blocking the only other exit and was more mobile. The shotgun was the greater danger, but he was focused on Miller. Split the focus. Isolate and neutralize. The thoughts were not words, but pure data, processed in milliseconds. Her body moved with a purpose that was both terrifying and beautiful. She picked up a heavy glass beer stein from an abandoned table, its weight feeling solid and familiar in her hand. Her movements were utterly silent, her flat shoes making no sound on the beer-sticky floor. She was a ghost, just as Miller had called her, but not a passive one. She was a wraith of pure, focused intent. The wiry man with a knife grabbed the nearest person, a young waitress, and pulled her in front of him as a human shield, pressing the blade to her throat. The girl let out a choked sob. "Back off, cops! I'll cut her! I swear to God, I'll cut her!" This was the critical moment. The introduction of a hostage changed the entire dynamic. Miller froze, his face a mask of indecision. His training told him to de-escalate, but his instinct was to press the attack. He was caught between two contradictory impulses, and his hesitation was a death sentence. The shotgunner saw his chance, leveling his weapon to take the shot. Time seemed to warp, stretching and thinning. The narrator of the scene was no longer the loud chaos, but the profound silence of the Admiral's mind. She saw the twitch in the shotgunner's finger, the widening of the hostage-taker's eyes, the tear tracing a path through the waitress's makeup. She saw it all, not as an unfolding tragedy, but as a sequence of solvable problems. And then she acted. She didn't shout a warning. She didn't announce her presence. She threw the heavy glass stein. It wasn't a panicked toss. It was a calculated, precise throw aimed not at the man with the knife, but at the large mirror behind the bar, directly in his line of sight. The stein hit the mirror with an explosive crash, a starburst of fractured glass erupting outwards. For a critical half-second, every eye in the room, including those of the two assailants, snapped towards the sound. It was the oldest trick in the book, misdirection, but it worked. In that half-second of distraction, Admiral Hayes covered the 12 feet between her and the hostage-taker. She moved in a low, gliding rush that seemed to defy physics. Her first point of contact was her left hand, which came up under his knife arm, not to block, but to redirect. Her fingers found the radial nerve bundle in his forearm with surgical precision and squeezed. The man's hand spasmed open, the knife clattering harmlessly to the floor. Simultaneously, her right hand struck the side of his neck, at the carotid sinus, a blow designed not to injure, but to momentarily disrupt blood flow to the brain, causing instantaneous vertigo and disorientation. He staggered back, his eyes rolling, his shield, the waitress, stumbling free. Hayes didn't stop. She flowed into the next movement, a textbook hip throw that used his own momentum against him. He was lifted off his feet and slammed onto his back, the air exploding from his lungs with a sickening gasp. Before he could even process what had happened, she was on him, one knee pinning his shoulder, the other on his chest, her hands expertly securing his arms behind him. The entire sequence, from the throw of the stein to the complete neutralization of the threat, had taken less than 3 seconds. It was not a fight. It was a removal. It was the physical expression of overwhelming competence. The room was plunged into a new kind of silence, one born not of fear, but of sheer, unadulterated awe. The shotgunner, who had been about to fire at Miller, was left standing dumbfounded, his weapon half-lowered, his brain struggling to catch up with the impossible event he had just witnessed. He stared at the unassuming, middle-aged woman who had just dismantled his partner with the cold efficiency of a machine. Sergeant Miller stood frozen, his own gun still raised, his mouth hanging slightly open. The words he had spoken just minutes before, mocking her, calling her weak and passive, echoed in the cavernous silence of his mind. He had been playing checkers, and he had just discovered, to his horror, that he was in a game of three-dimensional chess with a grandmaster. The quiet woman from the corner had just demonstrated a level of skill he had only ever seen in training videos, a level of calm under fire he had never personally witnessed. In that moment, his entire worldview, his carefully constructed hierarchy of strength and weakness, was shattered into a million pieces. The waitress was sobbing, but now from relief. The chief petty officer was on his feet, his face a mask of stunned respect. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he had just seen something extraordinary. The only sound was the harsh, ragged breathing of the robber on the floor and the impossibly steady, calm breathing of the woman holding him there. She looked up, her gray eyes sweeping the room once more, locking onto the remaining threat. She didn't say a word. She just held the shotgunner's gaze, and in that silent, unwavering stare was a simple, undeniable message. "You're next." The shotgun clattered to the floor as the second man slowly, tremblingly, raised his empty hands into the air. The aftermath was a strange tableau of frozen disbelief. For a long moment, no one moved. The spell was only broken by the distant, approaching scream of sirens, a sound that seemed to be rushing to catch up to an event that was already over. It was Sergeant Miller's junior officers who moved first, their training finally kicking in. They surged forward, securing the surrendered shotgunner, cuffing the already subdued man on the floor, and beginning to control the scene. They moved with a newfound hesitancy, their eyes constantly flicking toward the gray-haired woman who was now calmly helping the terrified waitress to her feet, her voice a low, soothing murmur that was lost in the growing noise. Miller holstered his weapon, his hand shaking slightly. He felt a wave of adrenaline crash over him, leaving a bitter, coppery taste of shame in his mouth. He was the senior officer. He was supposed to be in charge. Yet, he had frozen, hesitated, and nearly gotten himself and others killed. This woman, this civilian, had resolved a deadly hostage situation in seconds with nothing more than a beer stein in her bare hands. He approached her, his mind a scramble of confusion, embarrassment, and a dawning, grudging respect. "Ma'am," he began, his voice raspy. You have to stay here. We need your statement. Who are you? How did you do that?" Admiral Hayes turned to face him. Her expression was unreadable, her calm a stark contrast to the chaotic scene. Her heart rate, she noted with detached professionalism, was perhaps 5 beats per minute above resting. "The situation is contained, Sergeant. Your priority should be the well-being of the civilians and the integrity of the crime scene." Her voice was quiet but carried an unmistakable weight, the casual authority of someone who had spent a lifetime giving orders and having them followed without question. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a directive. Miller, a man who bristled at any challenge to his authority, found himself nodding meekly. "Right. Yes, of course." He felt small, his uniform suddenly feeling like a costume. The bar was now flooded with more police officers and paramedics. The scene was being taped off. Statements were being taken. And through it all, Admiral Hayes remained an island of tranquility. She gave her statement to a young, earnest patrolman in a clear, concise, and technical manner. She used precise terminology, distractionary device, joint manipulation, non-lethal takedown, that made the young officer's eyes widen. She omitted any mention of Miller's behavior, focusing only on the objective facts of the incident. Her professionalism was absolute. It was then that Police Chief Williams arrived. A former Marine colonel, Williams was a man who carried the quiet, unshakable gravitas of a career spent in high-stakes environments. He was tall and lean, his face a roadmap of hard-won experience. He moved through the chaotic crime scene with an economy of motion that commanded respect, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. He listened to a breathless summary from one of his lieutenants, his gaze sweeping the room until it landed on the woman in the gray sweater. He saw Miller trying to assert control, his voice still a little too loud, his gestures a little too broad, a man desperately trying to reclaim a narrative that had slipped from his grasp. William's eyes narrowed, ignoring Miller completely. He walked past his own sergeant, his focus entirely on the woman. He stopped a few feet from her, his head tilted slightly. There was something familiar about her. The posture, the unwavering stillness, the way she stood as if rooted to the very core of the earth. He had seen it before, on the decks of aircraft carriers, in the dust of forward operating bases, in the sterile silence of tactical operations centers. It was the physical signature of command. He looked closer, at the faint scar near her temple, at the piercing intelligence in her gray eyes. And then, a memory clicked into place. A briefing in the Pentagon, years ago. A very senior, very respected female officer at the head of the table, commanding a room full of generals and admirals with her quiet, incisive intellect. Her name, it was Hayes. It couldn't be. He approached her slowly. Miller, seeing the chief heading for the civilian who had upstaged him, stepped forward to intercept. "Chief, this is the civilian who interfered. I had the situation under control, but she—" Chief Williams didn't even break stride. He held up a single hand, a gesture that silenced Miller more effectively than a shout ever could. He stopped directly in front of Evelyn Hayes. He looked at her for a long, silent moment, his face unreadable. The surrounding officers and witnesses fell quiet, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, another drama about to unfold. Then, Chief Williams did something that sent a shockwave through every cop in the room. He straightened his back, his shoulders squaring. He brought his right hand up in a salute so crisp, so perfect, it could have been on a parade ground at Quantico. It was a gesture of profound, unambiguous respect, a subordinate acknowledging a superior officer. "Admiral Hayes," he said, his voice clear and ringing in the sudden hush. "I apologize for the disturbance, ma'am. I was not aware you were gracing our city with a visit." The word Admiral detonated in the silence. It echoed off the beer-soaked walls and shattered the last of Sergeant Miller's composure. His face, already pale, turned the color of ash. His jaw went slack. Every sailor in the bar, especially the old chief petty officer, snapped to a rigid posture of attention. The cops looked at each other in stunned confusion. The tourist, the lonely woman, the ghost, was an admiral. Miller felt the floor drop out from under him. The public mockery, the condescending tone, the utter dismissal. It all came rushing back to him, each memory a fresh wave of humiliation. He had not just insulted a civilian. He had shown profound disrespect to a 4-star flag officer. In a military town, this was an unforgivable sin. Williams held his salute until Hayes gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. "As you were, Chief," she said, her tone unchanged. "You have a fine department." It was a simple, professional courtesy, but in that context, it felt like an absolution. Williams lowered his hand. He turned his head slowly, his eyes finding Sergeant Miller. The look on the chief's face was not one of anger. It was something far worse, a cold, clinical disappointment. "Sergeant," Williams said, his voice dangerously quiet, "I want you to run the name for me." For the official record, he knew who she was, but he wanted Miller to hear it. He wanted everyone to hear it. He wanted the lesson to be inscribed with acid. A trembling Miller spoke her name into his shoulder radio. "Dispatch, run a check on a Hayes, Evelyn R." The radio crackled to life almost immediately, the dispatcher's voice tinny and official, but laced with an undertone of awe. "Be advised, Unit 214. That individual is Admiral Evelyn R. Hayes. 4-star, current CANCLANTFLT. Commander, United States Fleet Forces Command. Holder of the Navy Cross, Defense Distinguished Service Medal, 3 Navy Distinguished Service Medals, Legion of Merit." The voice continued, a relentless staccato recitation of a legendary career. Director of Naval Intelligence, Commander of the 6th Fleet, the architect of strategic operations whose names were still classified. Each title, each medal, was a hammer blow to Miller's arrogance. The dispatcher concluded, "Subject is considered to have Tier 1 clearance and is afforded all courtesies of her rank." Acknowledge Miller couldn't speak. The radio crackled again. "Unit 214. Acknowledge." He fumbled with the radio, his hands slick with sweat. "Acknowledged." He choked out, the word barely a whisper. Chief Williams let the silence hang for a moment longer. Then he turned back to Miller, his voice now stripped of all warmth. "Sergeant, you stood in this bar, and you made an assumption. You judged a person based on their gender, their age, and the fact they weren't wearing a uniform. You mistook quiet for weakness. You mistook stillness for passivity. Tonight, that assumption almost got you killed. The person who saved your life, and the lives of everyone in this room, was the very person you chose to publicly humiliate. Williams gestured around the room. Look around you, Sergeant. This is your lesson. Respect is not about the uniform you wear. It's about the competence you possess. And you, tonight, were witness to a masterclass. Now, go secure my crime scene. The Admiral and I have matters to discuss. The story of what happened at the anchor line traveled faster than a signal flare in the night. It didn't just spread, it detonated. It was whispered in the hushed corridors of the police precinct, shouted in the noisy mess decks of the aircraft carrier docked in port, and debated in every bar and coffee shop in the waterfront district. Within 48 hours, the incident had transcended mere gossip and was hardening into legend. The details were embellished with each telling. The beer stein she threw became a whiskey bottle. The 3-second takedown became an instantaneous blur of motion. Some versions had her disabling both men simultaneously. Others claimed she had stared the shotgun out of the second man's hands. The truth was already spectacular, but the myth was irresistible. For the sailors of the fleet, it was a source of immense pride. Their ultimate commander, the 4-star Admiral who was usually just a name on a document or a distant figure in a photograph, had walked among them as a civilian and proven, in the most visceral way imaginable, the core ethos of the silent professional. She was one of them, but she was also the pinnacle of what they aspired to be: calm under pressure, lethally competent, and utterly without ego. They started calling the corner booth at the bar the Admiral's Perch, and sailors would make pilgrimages to it, sitting there for a moment in quiet reverence before ordering a drink. For the city's police force, the story was a more complex and sobering lesson. It became known simply as Miller's Incident. It was a cautionary tale, a brutal reminder of the dangers of assumption. Chief Williams made sure of it. He didn't fire Miller. That would have been too easy. Instead, he made Miller the designated instructor for a new mandatory training module for all officers, rookie and veteran alike, titled Situational Awareness and Threat Assessment Beyond the Uniform. The first slide of the presentation was a grainy security camera still from the bar, showing a middle-aged woman in a gray sweater moving like smoke towards a man with a knife. Sergeant Frank Miller was a changed man. The public humiliation was profound, but the private one was deeper. He replayed the events in his mind 1,000 times, his own loud, foolish words echoing in his memory, followed by the deafening silence of her actions. The arrogance that had been his armor for so long had been shattered, and in its place was a raw, painful humility. He had built his identity on a specific model of strength, loud, physical, and overtly masculine. Admiral Hayes had shown him a different kind, a strength that was quiet, internal, and so vastly superior to his own that it defied comparison. He conducted his first training session with a tremor in his voice. He stood before a room of his peers, men and women he had once lorded his authority over, and he told the story. He didn't spare himself. He recounted his own words, his own prejudice, his own catastrophic failure of judgment. I looked at her, and I saw nothing, he told the silent room. That was my mistake. I wasn't looking. I was projecting. I wanted her to be weak, so I could feel strong. I wanted her to be insignificant, so I could feel important. He clicked to the next slide, a cleaned-up official photograph of Admiral Evelyn Hayes, for stars gleaming on her collar. This is who I saw nothing in. She commands the entire Atlantic Fleet. Her decisions affect global security. And when things went bad, she didn't need a gun, a badge, or a uniform. She just needed who she was. Never, ever, assume you know who you're looking at. Your life and the lives of others might depend on your ability to see past your own biases. The sessions were brutally honest, and they slowly began to earn him a new kind of respect, one forged not from fear or swagger, but from a willingness to own his failure. And what of the Admiral herself? She was gone by the next morning. Her visit had been a quiet, unofficial one, a personal trip to visit the grave of a fallen subordinate at the local naval cemetery. After her discussion with Chief Williams, during which she politely but firmly declined to press any charges or file any further reports, a discreet black sedan had picked her up from the back of the police station. She was back at Fleet Forces Command Headquarters by 0800, seated at the head of a massive conference table, leading a high-level briefing on carrier strike group deployments in the North Atlantic. No one on her staff knew what had transpired the night before. There was no change in her demeanor, no hint of the life-or-death struggle she had engaged in. When a young aide, who had heard a garbled rumor through a friend stationed locally, dared to ask, "Ma'am, is it true you were involved in an incident at a bar last night?" Admiral Hayes looked up from her briefing papers, her gray eyes calm and steady. "There's a disruption," she said, her voice even. The local police handled it with professionalism. Now, let's talk about the readiness of the Second Fleet. The subject was closed. The action was the only statement required. For her, the incident was not a moment of glory or vindication. It was simply a problem that had presented itself and had been solved with the tools she had. The highest praise she could give was to call it resolved. Her silence on the matter was more powerful than any boast could ever be. It was the silence of true competence, the quiet confidence of someone whose worth was measured not in words, but in a lifetime of decisive action. Back in the port city, the owner of the anchor line, a retired Navy bosun's mate, took down the shattered mirror. In its place, he hung a simple, framed photograph of the guided missile destroyer USS Michael Murphy, a ship named for a Medal of Honor recipient known for his quiet professionalism. And beneath it, on the wall of the corner booth, he mounted a small, polished brass plaque. It had no name, no date. It bore only 3 words, etched in simple block letters. Si vis pacem, if you want peace. The unspoken second half of the phrase, parabellum, prepare for war, hung in the air, a silent tribute to the quiet warrior who had come and gone, leaving nothing behind but a lesson and a legend. A year passed. The story of the Admiral at the anchor line became a piece of institutional folklore, a foundational myth for both the naval base and the city police department. It was no longer just a story about a bar fight. It was a parable about the nature of power, respect, and the vast, often invisible depths of human capability. For the sailors, it was a source of pride and a moral compass. The phrase, "Be the Admiral," became a quiet exhortation on the lower decks, a reminder to cultivate a competence so profound that it required no announcement. It meant being the sailor who knew their job inside and out, who was steady in a crisis, who didn't boast or brag, but simply performed. The legend served to reinforce the highest ideals of the service, the quiet professional who puts duty before ego. For the police, the impact was more formal and transformative. Chief Williams, inspired by the incident, fundamentally overhauled his department's training philosophy. He brought in new instructors, many of them veterans from special operations communities, to teach de-escalation, threat recognition, and unarmed combat techniques, all with an emphasis on the quiet professional mindset. The goal was to build officers who were less like Miller had been, loud, reactive, and reliant on the authority of the uniform, and more like Admiral Hayes, calm, observant, and possessed of a confidence that came from genuine skill, not just a badge. The Miller's Incident training module became a rite of passage for every new recruit, a humbling first lesson in the realities of the job. And Sergeant Frank Miller himself became the most compelling part of that lesson. The experience had stripped him down to his foundations and forced him to rebuild. He was quieter now, more thoughtful. He listened more than he spoke. He had lost his swagger, but he had gained a weight, a gravitas, that made him a far more effective officer and leader. One crisp autumn afternoon, Miller was giving a new rookie, a fresh-faced kid named Officer Chun, a driving tour of the city. Chun was sharp, eager, but Miller could see the same spark of overconfidence in him that he once had. As they drove down the waterfront, Miller slowed the patrol car as they passed the anchor line. "See that bar?" he asked, his voice quiet. Chun nodded. "Yeah, the anchor line. Heard it's a cop and Navy hangout." "It is," Miller said, "but it's also a classroom. The most important one in this city." He pulled the car over to the curb and killed the engine. He turned to the rookie, his eyes serious. "I'm going to tell you a story. Not the one you might have heard in the locker room. The real one. Because it's the most important thing you'll learn in your first year." He told Chin everything. He started with his own arrogance, his stupid, condescending words about a woman drinking water. He described her stillness, the way the whole room underestimated her. He described the terror and chaos when the robbers burst in, and his own moment of frozen panic. Then he described what she did. He spoke of it with a kind of reverence, the memory still as clear as if it were yesterday. She didn't have a weapon, Chun. She didn't have a badge. She didn't have a uniform. Everyone in that room, including me, looked at her and saw nobody. But she had something more powerful than any of that. She had competence, decades of it, forged in places you and I can't even imagine. When the moment came, she didn't need to shout. She didn't need to posture. She just acted, and her action was more decisive than a whole squad of us with guns drawn. He pointed to the corner booth, visible through the bar's window. They call that the Admiral's perch now. You're going to hear a lot of stories in this job, a lot of advice. But I want you to remember this one. The loudest person in the room is almost never the most dangerous. The most decorated uniform is not always the most capable warrior. Your job is not to judge the surface. Your job is to see the depths. Assume nothing. Respect everyone. And work every single day to be so good at what you do that you don't have to tell anyone. They'll know it when they see it. Chun was silent for a long time, staring at the unassuming bar. The lesson landed with the force of a physical blow. This was not about tactics or procedures. It was about the fundamental character of a public servant, a warrior, a professional. It was a lesson in humility, learned through the searing experience of another. "Thank you, Sergeant," Chun said finally, his voice full of a new respect. "I'll remember that." Miller nodded, started the car, and pulled back into traffic. He had passed the lesson on. The Admiral's legacy was not just in a plaque on a wall, but in the living memory and changed behavior of those she had encountered. True legacy isn't something you proclaim. It's something others choose to carry forward. It's a standard set, a lesson taught, a myth that inspires better versions of ourselves. The quiet Admiral, in her brief, explosive visit, had not just stopped a robbery. She had recalibrated the moral compass of an entire community, reminding them that true authority is earned in silence and proven in action. The ripples of that single, quiet evening continued to spread, a testament to the enduring power of demonstrated quiet competence. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption, and where true strength defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.